Thank you for coming on this beautiful day to delve into what for many people is a difficult subject, the subject of why we ended up with a civil war over slavery, whose impact continues to resonate in our country today. Well, it's not going backwards anyway. The first slide, maybe you saw when you came in. What I'm going to do is based on this book, which came out last November, and I am going to give you the main arguments of this book and then elaborate that in terms of the role that Virginia played in every element of this argument, because it was an outsized role, Virginia being the most populous and powerful colony at the time. And we all know the significant leaders who were involved in building our country from this state. So the book proceeds with, and by no means are these thorough arguments. To do that, you have to buy the book. They're available afterwards. So these are the theses. One is, which are documented in the book, the American Revolution created a strong anti-slavery movement. Anti-slavery was an integral part of the American Revolutionary upsurge, and it was the strongest in the world. If someone tried to convince you that Britain was more anti-slavery, I can only tell you that the first anti-slavery abolition organization was established 13 years before Britain in the colony of Pennsylvania. But there'll be more. But my argument is, to realize abolition, you had to change the economic system. A moral approach alone would not function to shift the behavior of a whole country. And as long as and this meant that we had to get out of being a purely raw materials producing country, providing all those raw materials as we were enjoined to do, forced to do, in fact, by Great Britain, and get all of our manufactured necessities from them. That was basically a form of imperial control, which had to be broken if the slavery question. So the industrialization and anti-slavery are joined at the hip. That's a crucial point here. Thirdly, Alexander Hamilton was the guy on the scene who made proposals that could do that. Of course, it didn't happen on his watch for sure, but he began to lay the basis for that with what I call the American system. It was later called the American system in the period Rich discussed, the late teens and mid 1820s. But in fact, the whole basis for that was laid with Hamilton. And lastly, tragically, it was the sabotage of that program that effectively made the Civil War necessary to end slavery. And I believe that turning point was approximately 1833, with Andrew Jackson's vetoing and destruction of the key pillars of the American system of economics, which had been put into effect by the Quincy Adams administration. So those are the theses. And I'm going to go through each of those and give you a picture of the role of Virginians in all of them. So the early anti-slavery movement, if you've heard anything about it, you've heard about the Quakers, right? It was the Quakers. And there were a lot of them. Actually, I read somewhere recently, maybe almost 20% in certain periods, early periods of our history. And we had them in Virginia. And they took the lead, it's true. Particularly this fellow in Pennsylvania, Anthony Benezet. He began with running schools for Black children both enslaved and free. He wrote major exposés. They were circulated internationally, helping build an international anti-slavery movement. And he was the one who established that first abolition society in 1775 in Philadelphia. So that he was not the only one, but he was the most significant, known all over the colonies. You had the New England Congregationalists, and here some of them were extremely influential and strong on this question, including Samuel Adams, whom you all have heard of in other contexts, who kept introducing legislation to not only ban the slave trade, but ban slavery outright. James Otis, who is known for opposing the universal search warrants called the writs of assistance, took that further in his argumentation and writings to talk about the natural rights of man, all men, Black and white. He said, why should, just because someone has curly hair, should they be a slave? This was a shock across Massachusetts, but that document was circulated throughout. These are not inconsequential people, and they're not excoriated for doing this either. But you also had Virginia. You had people in the Lee family. These are in about the 1760s. This is obviously the period where the revolutionary ferment is getting hotter and hotter after the 7 Years' War and the British reaction to American uppityness, which they had after the 7 Years' War. So you had major writings and other legislation proposed, which I'll get into later, that from people like Richard Henry Lee and also Arthur Lee, who was actually a cousin, I believe. So they're talking about the nature of slavery being destructive of the economy, as well as destructive morally, both for whites and for those oppressed. This idea was widespread among the elite, but in the buildup to the revolution, you're familiar with the Fairfax Resolves, right? As these were taken following as a reaction to the coercive acts in Boston and as a means of moving toward uniting the colonies in defense of Boston, because they saw what was happening to Boston as a potential threat to everyone. So in order to get the sense of the population, the Virginia Assembly had asked to take the temperature of counties throughout the colony. And in Fairfax Resolves, they actually included, as they were the only one, included an attack on slavery, that we want to see an entire stop to put to this wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. And they linked it to the question of developing our own manufacturers, which was very much on the minds as a long-standing grievance of the colonists. In that same period, building up to the First Continental Congress, you had the Jefferson issuing a paper, which was instructions to the delegates to the Virginia Convention, which was to proceed and provide the input of Virginia into the Continental Congress. And here again, he says that it's universally thought that we want to get rid of slavery. it's a great object of desire in these colonies, not just Virginia, but including Virginia. Now, of course, there's a lot of naysaying and doubt about the accuracy of that, or even Jefferson's sincerity. But I think there is considerable evidence that the morality question was, and the economic question, were very much on the minds of those who were proceeding from this standpoint. The First Continental Congress does ban importation of slaves, but it goes beyond just importation of slaves. It actually banned any participation in the slave trade with any other country beside Great Britain, which there's an author named Christian McBurney wrote a very interesting series on that. You know, why, if, you know, they could have, the slave traders could have leased their ships to somebody else to be involved in the slave trade, or they could have negotiated with the Spanish and the Portuguese and others who would carry out the slave trade. That was all banned, and it was enforced. The ban was forced. There was an end to the slave trade entirely up through the next decade, actually. So that happened. And to address this question of, well, did they really mean it? Were they really against slavery? Well, first we come to the Declaration and the all men are created equal, which again underscored that kind of belief that this was wrong. Did they mean it? My example here comes from the Vice President of the Confederacy in 1861, who's Alexander Stephens, who said, yes, they meant it. They thought that eliminating the slave trade was the first step to eliminating slavery. They thought slavery was morally wrong, but they were wrong, said Alexander Stephens. And we in the Confederacy are going to establish a government based on the reality that this is an inferior race and they deserve to be enslaved. So the belief in, so it's not just from Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or others who said that this was the case. It was also leading members of the Confederacy who had some reason to believe what they said. Virginia's participation in this in the Revolution, scholarship has indicated they had the most Black soldiers outside New England. They began to loosen manumission. This is one fellow who became famous at the Battle of Great Bridge, Billy Flora. He was a free Black who ended up doing okay afterwards. But of course, not everybody did. But in the course of, as the book goes through, in the course of the Revolutionary period itself and afterwards, there was a dramatic change legally as well in the treatment of slavery. Vermont being the first, was they were still part of New York. They always say they had two revolutions, one against New York and one against the Great Britain. Then you had Pennsylvania, then you had Massachusetts, and then you had loosening of restrictions on manumission. Interesting to know that prior to 1782, it was illegal to manumit your slaves in Virginia unless you got permission from the governing powers of the state and gave a special reason to do so. 1783, Virginia declared all Blacks who served in the Revolution should be honored in the Pledge of Freedom that they were given. I don't know if it happened all the time, but that they passed the law. It obviously reflected a sentiment, and there continued to be legislation. It's all slow. It's all, inadequate from a absolutist standpoint, but it's a dramatic shift, unique in the world, against the existence of slavery, and the number of free Blacks rises significantly. And then you have the Constitution. There are a number of aspects to that. This is obviously a complex question. I'm just dealing with the certain elements of it. Banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. That, you could read Lincoln's Cooper Union address if you really want to get Brindlick about it. Established a date for the abolition of the slave trade, refused to recognize not only the word slavery, but the idea that slaves are property. There was actually a vote in the Constitutional Convention where the Southerner said we should identify them such, and that was voted down. And then the powers that were given that could move us to eliminating slavery, the belief being that it was going to be on its way out. Control over the territories, commitment to the general welfare. Patrick Henry was known to have said in his opposition to the Constitution, well, what if they decide that it's against the general welfare to have slaves? Well, maybe we shouldn't have this, broad understanding of the federal government and powers of the federal government. Federal control over interstate commerce and the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And I always think it's significant for people to keep in mind what Frederick Douglass had to say about the Constitution. I'm not going to go into that, but he defied anyone to say it was a pro-slavery document. He saw it as a step in the direction of ending it. And the abolition movement did continue after that, and including in Virginia, including in a number of southern states, actually. This was a Quaker, Robert Pleasants, from down in the area of between Richmond and the Tidewater, actually around Richmond. He established the Virginia Abolition Society, and there was a national convention of abolition societies established in 1794. Then we have the, people beginning to manumit slaves, trying to do so, complicated question, but process beginning. And then reactions as well, with people getting upset about the number of free Blacks and a move toward in the other direction. That very much fed by the Haitian Revolution, where the country was being flooded with refugees from Haiti, which created an environment which allowed for a lot of reaction. So that's a little lengthy, but I will go to part two. But I think it's very important. Whole books have been written to revive this idea that the abolition movement didn't start in the 1830s. It started much earlier than that, and it was built, the 1830s built on what was done in that earlier period, the people who were educated, the people who began to take action and so forth. So to end slavery, the British imperial economic system had to be changed. Constantly, when action was taken against the slave trade or slavery itself in the colonies, every action was vetoed by the British. This is just a short list. This started in 1712. It went on again and again in Virginia, it went on again and again in Massachusetts. This was, their argument was straightforward. This is a source of income, and we don't want to lose this source of income, and you can't do it. So in addition, leading economists, those who were I, I don't know whether you could call it crown economists or not, that's what I called him here, Adam Smith, were technically anti-slavery, but they were on record being absolutely against the US industrializing. Smith directly says in the Wealth of Nations that it would be a disaster for the United States to put its resources into building up manufacturers and not keeping open trade with us. Hamilton said, what a hypocrite you are. He didn't say it that way, but that's what he meant. You know, this is just the opposite. You know, we will lose our prosperity, never have our prosperity that we deserve if we don't have manufacturing. So there was an official policy economically against the conditions that would allow slavery to end. And Jefferson agreed with Adam Smith. Jefferson believed that our workshops should remain in Europe. We shouldn't have manufacturing here. These are from 1782, 1792, but his actions as president reinforced that, despite the fact that he had to somewhat take back that view after the disaster of the War of 1812, where it was clear that there had been some problem with our not having our own independent capability. Britain was the largest market for the product of the slave trade here, the slave existence, the American cotton, up to 80%. And they bargained with the Southern cotton producers. You know, we could get our cotton from Brazil, we could get it from Egypt, you know, if you should have lower the price, right? Well, how do you lower the price? You increase the oppression of those who were working for you. So, and the British played a major role in financing slavery's expansion. This was very interesting thesis that I found, where this woman describes how there were agents of British companies throughout the South going to the plantation owners and saying, you know, we got credit for you. Why don't you, go to Mississippi? Why don't you go to Alabama? It's really good there. Let's expand the slavery. So they were given a financial incentive to do that directly from centers like Liverpool, Lancaster, and so forth. And there was an explicit policy the same on manufacturers, not just what Adam Smith had to say, but explicitly to flood the country as much as possible with cheap manufacturers so that you would bankrupt the companies that came into existence. This happened after the Revolutionary War. It happened again after the War of 1812. This is a fellow enunciating that policy after the War of 1812. It's worth us taking a loss to stifle US manufacturers in the cradle. So rather colorful language for what they intended to do. And they did as much as possible. Now, what was the alternative? The one on the scene was from Hamilton. And Hamilton was, from his earliest period in the colonies to become the United States, on record as against slavery. This is from his earliest writing, 1774. This is not only immoral, but it's also economically disastrous. He continued with that in the Manumission Society and in other ways, indicating his opposition to slavery. So when he becomes Treasury Secretary, he doesn't directly act against slavery, but he sets up the basis for that manufacturing society. The first aspect being to establish credit, a source of credit for manufacturers and infrastructure. This is the First National Bank. It still exists in Philadelphia. It was a commercial bank. It was intended to be a nursery for national wealth by providing credit for agriculture, commerce, and manufactures. And it was hugely contentious, as we will see. The first opposition came from Jefferson and Edmund Randolph, two members of the cabinet. And they said this was overreached by the federal government. It's not explicitly there. And unless you have something explicitly in the Constitution, you can't do it. Hamilton wrote a major document at the last minute to Washington right before he was possibly going to veto the bill. It passed both houses of Congress. And with the argument that this was a necessary and proper means of carrying out the objectives that are laid out in the Constitution. Not only objectives, but the responsibilities for the public credit and the conditions of prosperity in the United States. So they didn't succeed. Washington signed the bill, and the First National Bank went into existence. This was followed up by Hamilton with his push explicitly for support for manufacturers in the report from manufacturers. And for that, I can only recommend my first book, Hamilton versus Wall Street, because it's a long story. It's a long report. It's a 30,000-word report, but there he outlined the principles which are just absolutely antithetical to any slave system. No mention of slavery there, but the ideas are of what needs to be done, just the opposite of what the plantation owners were going to do. And he actually set up a pilot project to show how this would work. This, by the way, is Passaic Falls, New Jersey. It is the location of Paterson, New Jersey today. And it was where Hamilton set up a Society for Useful Manufactures in 1791, which it is still there. This obviously is not from his period, this is from the early 20th century, but it was the most powerful water source in the country because Niagara was still occupied by the British. And it was to be used with raceways to power a multi-industrial center, not a company town like Lowell or something like that. But, you know, in fact, they even subsidized startups, according to one of the scholars. So that was to indicate what the direction. And in fact, the report on manufacturers was circulated throughout the British Isles to try to recruit people to come and participate in that project. So what Hamilton argues, to really condense things, is that progress depends on increasing the productive powers of labor through mechanization, technological progress, and providing infrastructure, all of which were just the opposite of what slavery demands. You know, you have a mass labor force, you deploy them en masse, you don't invest in machinery. You don't want to have a lot of roads connecting or canals connecting areas of free labor with your slave labor, because people might get the wrong idea that they had an alternative to what was going on. You wanted to keep them in the dark. And then it goes further, of course, with education and so forth, opposing education. And Hamilton, while not explicit, well, he actually does explicitly call for the establishment of an institution which would support education, but not in those terms. But he makes it clear that what the country depended upon was creating, doing things that would allow people to creatively invent the technological progress that the country needed. This was the phrase that first hooked me on Hamilton as one of the objectives of manufacturers: stimulate the activity of the human mind, just the opposite of a slave system. So this is what he was putting forward, and it was seen as a threat. It was also known, however, to be an indictment of the situation, the economic situation in places like Virginia. Because as early as the 1790s, international visitors would come to Virginia and say, my goodness, but this place, compared to New England, looks like a wasteland. I mean, the houses are poor, it takes you forever to get anywhere because the roads are ruts, there's no schooling, it's just, there are all these idle people because work was considered to be below, work was devalued as slave labor. So this was, it was well known, and there would be occasional attempts by people in the South to shift the situation and invest in infrastructure and so forth. A lot of fights here in Loudoun County, which we discussed before, to try to get a bank, credit facilities so that farmers could actually get credit and so forth. These were resisted by the South. And as we know, and Hamilton knew and put forward, real wealth depended upon those investments, depended upon infrastructure, education, the power to produce. This is Eastern Pennsylvania, which was another alternative example to what was going on in Virginia. Now, Hamilton did have supporters in Virginia, particularly up here in the northern part, where George Washington held a certain amount of influence, but also John Marshall, who became a very powerful force later on through the Supreme Court. But they were unsuccessful in breaking the political hammerlock that was on against that kind of Hamiltonian program. And then we get to the sabotage question, where in a way, I think this is where Virginia, unfortunately, in collaboration with New York City, plays the most outsized role in this development, which we'll get to. So it starts off with the Jefferson administration. And he tries from the very beginning to kill Hamilton's program, soup to nuts, starting with the National Bank, support for infrastructure, reduce taxes so much that we had no basis for defense, and discourage manufacturers. His expert Gallatin wouldn't go along with the first because he said that it was the banking system was absolutely essential to the United States existing. So he wouldn't get rid of that. But the propaganda was out there. Jefferson did not stop the propaganda against the bank. Secondly, an example, the Louisiana Purchase. Obviously, this was the most massive expansion of slave territory in the country. There was already slavery there. And Jefferson wasn't responsible for introducing it. It was there for the Spanish and the French. But interestingly enough, what I found was that Congress, not only when they passed the legislation for the purchase, not only banned the international slave trade into Louisiana, but also internal trade. So in other words, it would have been illegal for the for Virginians to ship slaves into the Louisiana Territory. That bill passed in 1803 was repealed in 1804. And that was done with the approval of Jefferson. I think his excuse at the time was that this would cause a revolt in New Orleans and other places like that. But that's one of those turning points. Jefferson's explicit policy on slavery expansion at that point was that a diffusion strategy. The idea being that if you spread slavery thinly throughout the country, that would create less reaction, and therefore, because people wouldn't be afraid of a slave revolt by masses in their area, and that would soften their minds and we'd eventually be able to eliminate it. I think that's lunatic. I've yet to find anyone who thinks that would have worked. But that's he basically withdrew his support for banning slavery in the expansion of slavery. Now, his anti-industrial policy of the Jeffersonians did backfire because of the results of the War of 1812. I mean, that was really, we hung by a hair, right? The burning of Washington, and a difficulty that we had mobilizing troops and defeating them. And in a sense, you could say we were saved by Napoleon because the British preferred, thought he was the greater threat. But there was a big reaction. The government here was bankrupt. We couldn't pay our debts. The Bank of the United States had been eliminated on the eve of the war, and that with the vote, the tie-breaking vote by the vice president, and so there was a reaction that this. I mean, I won't go through who organized the reaction to organized that movement, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. But what preceded was a reemergence of the Hamiltonian program by name. And this came together as the American system. Henry Clay was a leader of that. John Marshall at the Supreme Court, John Quincy Adams, and some Virginians, particularly Charles Fenton Mercer at that time, who was in the Congress. The program was, they did restore a national bank, Second National Bank. They went for tariffs to protect industry and tried to build industry, and they went to build infrastructure, canals in particular, and also start railroads. This is one of the canals, the C&O Canal, which began in 1828, I believe. And you can see this across the river there. So there was an upsurge in this direction, and this caused alarm among the plantation class, those supporting, not that it directly challenged slavery, but the industrialization drive was moving in that direction. John Quincy Adams was very anti-slavery and did certain things to try to mitigate some atrocities that were going on around the country. So the reaction was, in a sense, led by Jefferson still. Jefferson was still on the scene. He had established the University of Virginia. He insisted that there be no teaching of Hamiltonian ideas at the University of Virginia. He also virulently opposed John Quincy Adams's move and Monroe's move, actually, to to have government support for infrastructure planning. He was going to write a major document saying this is tyranny, the federal government to provide resources to build infrastructure. And Madison said, "Oh, don't do that, Tom. That's really a bad idea," because people wanted, infrastructure. But Jefferson was so committed to the states' rights view at that point, and to everything that underpinned it, that's what he did. Virginia also played a major role in trying to, oppose the national bank decision. This is a fellow from Richmond named Rockenbaugh, who said that this, was explicitly said that the proceeding of Hamilton's American system was going to interfere with the state, including slavery. So there were people who were explicit about it. Jefferson was not, but his had obviously a more outsized influence. But the crucial element here, as it comes together, is in the founding of the Democratic Party. Because with John Quincy Adams in power, with an American system program, a Hamiltonian program, it was determined by the Richmond plantation political class called the Richmond Junto, and New York linked, finance linked people to oppose this with a coalition. And they put together a coalition, which ended up founding the Democratic Party, the official founding being in 1828. The idea was that they were for the little man, and that the program of massive internal improvements and protection of manufacturers and credit for that was oppression of the little man. And they chose a military hero, Andrew Jackson, as their candidate. And as you know, he was successful. He was not outright in his program to begin with, but he was able to carry it forward. His key assault was on the Second Bank of the United States, which was a major source of funding for that infrastructure, and the investment in rapidly technologically improving industry. He targets and kills it, and that is a major turning point. Now, as I said before, there's Virginian objection. Actually, Madison, as I indicated, himself was involved in a conference in 1828 to say, we need to build infrastructure. This is really ridiculous that they never built a canal all the way through to the Ohio River the way they intended. They never put the funding behind it, and they were rejecting the funding from the federal government. That was not successful. And Mercer, who was the actual ranking member on the Manufacturers Committee, I believe, in the Congress, were attempting to move things in the other direction, but they did not move in that direction. Now, there's one other element of the Virginia situation that I think is important to highlight, because in that crucial period, we had the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. That had a lot of implications. He was educated, that fed into an intensification of the ban on teaching slaves to read, and all sorts of other harsh, increases in harsh treatment of the enslaved population. But it did something else. It also inspired the only debate in the Virginia legislature on the potential banning of slavery. Because all around the Commonwealth, there were petitions submitted to say, you know, this is too much, right? We're all under threat, you know, if we continue this policy. Plus, it's destroying us economically. Look at what a mess we're in compared to other states. Look at what, you know, we got to get rid of this, right? Some of these were from Quakers, some of them were from just women who didn't want, you know, who were frightened. Some were from other organizations. And they fed it into the legislature, and there was a concerted battle back from Tidewater related legislators, but they didn't, those legislators did not succeed. They ended up getting a discussion. And I just want to, I have in the book, I have 14 excerpts from 14 different documents in the anti-slavery movement. And one of them is by the fellow I'm going to just mention briefly, Samuel McDowell Moore. And I can recommend to you the Virginia the Encyclopedia of Virginia is a tremendous resource as a documenting of all these kind of events. So I had to cut it dramatically because these people talked. But in that debate, you know, he goes through soup to nuts, you know, why continuing slavery is an absolute disaster for Virginia. It's a disaster for the United States. It undercuts any image we have of believing in our founding principles. It's, you know, it's, you can't, you know, there's a drive for freedom in every human breast. This exists. You can never extirpate it. You can try all you want, but it's not going to work. And, you know, these people have the same rights as we have. Fairly extraordinary. The guy comes from Rockingham County in the somewhat western part, or maybe not extraordinary, but surprising to me anyway. Unfortunately, that is not the direction that the legislature ends up taking. In fact, it moves in the opposite. Well, they table the issue, but then pass a lot of repressive information. And after that period that you begin to get a flood of propaganda that slavery is a positive good. It's not a bad, you know, we're not doing something bad for economic reasons because we have to do it, but it's really for the good of those poor people, you know, and it's, and for our own good, for sure. And so as some of the most prescient minds at the time said, John Quincy Adams and Henry C. Carey in particular, it was that turning point in the 1830s that led to the Civil War, that made it inevitable that we were going to go in that direction. And I'll just conclude by saying, in my conclusion to the book, it's a really short chapter because I had no intention of saying what I thought, giving a program to deal with this. But why do it, right? One, people have to get the history straight. You know, we always had opposition to slavery in this country. It failed at an absolutely critical point, but we need to know that that existed and the impact that it had. We have to get the economics straight. There's a connection between what you can do, you know, what kind of economics are compatible with slavery and what kind are not. And that's the Hamiltonian question, in my view. Not that everything Hamilton did was perfect, far be it from me, but he was the guy on the scene that was the closest. And then restore our national purpose, because the only way that I see the cultural impact of everything we had to go through to end slavery, and are still in the process of doing to end racial prejudice, is that people start working together on a common objective. I mean, that's why it's only after the wars or in the course of the wars where Blacks are accepted for whatever reason into the army to defend the country that you get an improvement in racial relations, at least for a period of time. It's a heavy thing that helped lead to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, coming out of the revolution, coming out of World War II. So that's not a Virginia ending, but it's relevant, I think, and thank you very much.
Did any citizens of other countries come to the United States to participate in the Hamilton?
Question was, did people come from other countries to participate in the Hamiltonian revival? Yes, indeed, they did. You had them from England, you had them from Ireland, and later on in the 1820s, you had from Germany a very significant immigrant by the name of Friedrich List, who became a major transmission point for Hamiltonian economics throughout the world. In fact, I mean, even today in Asia, in Korea and Japan, he's better known than Hamilton per se, because his work was translated and spread throughout the world. So yes, indeed, you know, Hamilton was interested in bringing people here. I don't have a picture of the workforce at the Society for Useful Manufactures, but I do know that his attitude toward immigration at that point was extremely open, and the desire was to get skilled labor here and encourage people to come and build the country. Sorry. She knows more than I do, so.
Thank you. How do you reconcile the fact that he did enslave people?
Well, I don't believe he did. I don't believe she proved he did. I have read that document, and and there is a long refutation of that document in a website called Discovering Hamilton, by Michael Newton. And I also have a post on my blog, American System Now, which links to that. So if you look up Ser Filippi on my blog, you'll find that article and then the link to his refutation. You know what? She's extremely tendentious. She had to make some corrections. For example, in her first version, she had Alexander Hamilton in New York with slaves in the census, but Alexander Hamilton was living in Philadelphia at the time. So it was another Alexander Hamilton. I could give you other examples, but that is, I believe that was taken up with a political agenda, not with thorough research.
What 1774, which is what we're commemorating right now, the run up to the 250th anniversary. When you said what you talked about what's happening in terms of the anti-slavery, how did that connect to everything else that was going on? On importation, against the where's the max and so forth.
Well, the non-importation included non-importing slaves. That's the major connection that I know with that. And that was not necessarily known that that was going to happen. That article by series by Christian McBurney, which I was re-looking at this morning, indicated that one reason he thought it happened was that at that particular time, well, Georgia wasn't even able to send anybody to the First Continental Congress because the governor succeeded in preventing them to, and that South Carolina had less influence at the time. I don't know, but that's the only one I know.
I have a question. As you correctly pointed out, many of us are not aware of the history that you have shared today, the fact that there was significant abolition and resistance to slavery, even in colonial times and up to the Civil War, not just prior to the Civil War. To what do you ascribe the fact that we have not been given that hope?
Well,
What are some possible reasons?
well, I mean, we also have not had the full story of the horrible impact of slavery. You know, it's both that we haven't had, right? We've tended to have a patriotic gloss until Howard Zinn, I guess, or whatever. And then a throw out, you know, and then a switch in the other direction to say that everything was corrupted, so corrupt from the beginning that it shouldn't have existed. It's a superficiality, right? That's involved in what people think is. I think that what people think is necessary in mass education is to simplify everything, where I don't think that's the reality. If you have mass education should permit people to and encourage people for study in depth. I mean, we don't all have to study Greek. We don't all have to learn Greek, right? I mean, I went to a classical high school where once they did all have to learn Greek. When I got there, you just had to learn Latin. But you have to have a value on education that I think we are in danger of losing at the present time. And, you know, education in depth. Let people argue about things. Let people, you know, dig deep into why things happen. But you've got to have that kind of, I mean, you look at the self-educated heroes that we have in the country, and you look at a Lincoln and you look at a Frederick Douglass, and you see how much how important they felt that exploring in depth very significant philosophical questions and historical questions were. You know, they put their energy into that. It was the culture was conducive to that. Today, you know, the culture is less conducive to that, it seems to me. And that's, there's no question but that all of these developments that I'm talking about have, you know, they're not just the consequence of political action or economic action. They also have this deep cultural a framework for them. And for example, why would it be, you know, in my view, those 20 years of Jeffersonian presidents was not only disastrous from the massive increase in the slavery in that period and the sabotage of the economic development that could have occurred, but also that, you know, as you embed this in the culture, as long as it continues and becomes normal, right, it's harder to get rid of. People do react, you know, would have more difficulty going against what their neighbors were doing. It's everywhere, right? And it takes a stronger character to go against it. So there's a cultural acceptance over time, even if you don't, you know, if you ask somebody individual, do they believe it? No, but they act to be part of the culture. So
Thank you.
I would encourage you all, you can come up and speak to me, and those of you who haven't bought a book, I would be happy to sign or sell them to you. Thank you.
Thank you.